So,
So I was the first person ever to take Putnam really seriously and to draw out his thinking on every subject. And I viewed my job as really trying to understand him and then to re-express it in a way that other people could understand him, because he was extremely wedded to his own way of saying everything, his own language, which I dubbed Putnamese. And I remember I taped conversations, hoping to go, and then would go over them and ask him questions on every conversation we had later. I mean, we worked at this thing all day, every day, all summer for the years I was at Columbia, from 61 to 66.
let me ask you, how did you meet him? How did you did you know him at Princeton?
Yeah, I knew him. He came in, I think, a year after I did, although he was 10 years older than I was, and was working with John Wheeler. And I wasn't yet working with Wheeler, although I ended up doing so too. And Putnam was just this eccentric, solitary fellow around campus who once, I asked him something, and he turned to me and said, do you really want to know the answer to your question? So I was stuck, and I said, yeah. And then he launched into this incredibly complex, long answer. And right then I realized the guy was some kind of a genius, he had thought very deeply about everything. And so thus begun a serious and really almost formal mentor-apprentice relationship, which we carried on for 10 years and had an enormous effect on my life. I didn't become a disciple in the sense that I've devoted my life to trying to explain what Putnam was saying. Rather, it affected me, I think, in that it affected me as much from Putnam's breeding his understanding of the workings of power in the world, the fact that he was from a wealthy, powerful family. He was able to communicate to me the workings of power, which is certainly one of the key reasons I became a young college president and went to Oberlin in that capacity when I was just 33. That never would have been possible without learning from Putnam how to speak effectively to people with power and standing and status. And so there were effects he had on me that were quite apart, really, from the intellectual content of all his philosophical thinking. Although that, too, I spent years trying to write expositions of, and did publish 2 pieces, one with him and one on my own, in which I acknowledge it's an attempt to explain his thinking.
Why is it so opaque? I mean, why is his writing, his thinking?
Well, this gets to a very interesting question about Putnam is, why did he fail? We know he succeeded, but he also failed. He failed to become known in Princeton, in the world. He really should, I think, be regarded as one of the great philosophers of the century. And no one's ever heard of him. And people who have, even John Wheeler, who's no dummy. I mean, Wheeler is one of the most celebrated physicists of the century. Putnam worked closely with him. Wheeler wrote a book recently published called Geons, Black Holes, and Quantum Foam with Kenneth Ford. In it, there's a photo of Putnam, and Putnam is described in the book. Do you know this, Barry?
No,
It's very important. Very important. However, what do they concentrate on? They concentrate on Putnam's homosexuality.
In that book?
Yeah. I think it's an outrage. I said to Ken Ford, this is like writing a book on Feynman and mainly mentioning the fact that he went to bottomless bars. I mean, he did something else, didn't he? Feynman won the Nobel Prize in Physics and is one of the couple greatest physicists of the century. I think Putnam is one of the couple greatest philosophers of the century, but all that really merited discussion in this book, apart from his eccentricity, was the fact that he had admitted to Wheeler fairly early on that he was gay. And I remember when that happened. I remember it differently than it is in Wheeler's book, because Putnam wrote the letter and I read it and we worked on it together before he mailed it to Wheeler acknowledging his homosexuality. And Putnam was terrified to do this and told me that when he dropped it in the mailbox, it was one of the critical moments of his life. So it was something he knew Wheeler was going to have difficulty coping with. I didn't even know Putnam was gay for, I forget, 5 or 8 years that we worked together. He was just a solitary fellow, and he concealed that part of his life from me. He was close friends with my wife at the time, Ann Fuller, and was godfather to Karen, our first child. And so why did Putnam fail? And I'm using that word with quotes around it, because, you know, he made...
Let me really pick that up, but I just wanted to ask, about 5 or 8 years ago, Wheeler gave a talk at, I forget what school it was, but this guy was, Aston Jones was there in the audience as a graduate student. And he waited in the long line, then went up to Wheeler and mentioned Putnam's name. And immediately he was the only person of interest in the whole place, and the whole faculty. He forgot about them. He said, let's get together for lunch.
Who? He who?
Wheeler.
Wheeler said that to Jones.
To Jones.
Okay, go on.
And so they met the next day, and Wheeler told him that Putnam was one of the most brilliant students he ever had.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I interviewed him, he would not come forward and say that. I
No.
really tried to get him to say something positive, and he said, oh yeah, one time at Princeton there was a heated discussion, very passionate, and Putnam spoke very forcefully on the topic. Big deal. Another time in Europe, he was very helpful to me. He was able to find a place that would make posters for me.
This is the kind of thing that gets in this book. It's little nothings, you see. Because, see, Wheeler, when he goes public, has to be careful not to insult other of his graduate students, who are some of the most prominent physicists in the country now. And he doesn't want to put Putnam in their company, nor should he. Putnam never did any important physics, really.
Well, that's what he said. He said, I asked him, well, what do you think of Putnam's work? Well, he thought for a long time. He said, if anything comes from it, then it's important. And if not, then no. And the proof is in what happens.
Yeah,
basically.
but see, that gets at my point and my interest in what was it that was lacking in Putnam's work, that what accounts for the fact that no one ever got it. I spent 10 years trying to explain this stuff to the world. Coleman Clark has spent a lot of time trying to master it and find a way of putting it that will engage other people. He's failed too. So, why? I think Putnam, almost because of his breeding, his upbringing, his very upper class status, his money, didn't feel he had to do the very hard work of popularizing his own ideas. Now, I don't mean popularizing in the sense of to the public in newspapers. I mean the first stage of popularization, the role I tried to play for him, which is popularizing it to the other academics, making it, linking it to their syntax, linking it to the concepts they were using. A very important example of this was I went and studied neurophysiology, neuroanatomy. I even dissected a brain at Columbia Med School to try and do better by Putnam's work. And what's the matter, Barry? Is it not working?
No, it's working fine.
Oh,
It's
okay.
great.
Yeah,
When
okay.
you sit down a little bit lower, then I have to frame a little lower.
I see.
Be comfortable.
Okay,
Don't worry about
okay.
it. Everything is
Yeah,
great.
when I see you get distracted, it's harder for me to talk.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I came across in studying the neurophysiology the work of Donald Hebb, and it immediately resonated with what Putnam was saying, although Hebb, I think, anticipated Putnam's discovery of this particular idea. Putnam called it the NCRP, the Neural Conditioned Reflex Principle. Hebb, forget what Hebb called it, but it was the same thing. It was that when a nerve fires against another nerve, it increases its ability to do so later. There's something is secreted at the connection between the axon and the dendrite of the other cell or something. And so the resistance to firing the nerve is diminished every time it happens. Now, this is a key principle of explaining how behavior could be self-emergent out of a pile of neurons in a brain. So I brought this to Putnam's attention. I said, look at this guy Hebb. He seems to be saying something what you're saying. Well, Putnam's reaction was astounding. He dismissed it. He regarded Hebb as an idiot. He didn't take it seriously. That's exactly what he should have done, is take it very seriously. He should have linked all his stuff to what Hebb was doing and be willing to join another established scientist and work a little bit in Hebb's framework, a little bit in the traditional framework, if you will, in the traditional language. But Putnam just always stuck to his own way of seeing everything and saying everything, and that was, of course, essential to his originality, to his genius. But the unwillingness to link to other scientists' syntax cost him dearly. And is the reason, I think, that he never got the fame that his work really deserves and merits in terms of its originality and its content. The most important thing, I think Putnam will be known for, if his name ever does get out, is he was the first person I know of, and I think it can be documented, the first person ever in the world to recognize that the brain functions as a Darwin machine, that the brain works according to the principles that natural selection works by. That was why I finally, after getting this out of Putnam, he didn't put it that way. Needless to say, it took 3 years to get that sentence into existence. 3 years of conversations, hundreds of letters and discussion, in which I forced him to make diagrams, some of which are in our article in General Systems. I'll just quote this, give a reference to this article now, in case anyone ever wants to look it up. It's General Systems Yearbook of the Society for General Systems Research, Volume 11, 1966, page 99. And the article is called On the Origin of Order in Behavior, picking up on Darwin's famous title On the Origin of Species, because I finally realized that that's what Putnam was saying. I mean, all the original ideas are his. Some of the popularization is mine. And a lot of Putnam's clarifications only resulted because I hammered and hammered and hammered at him and forced him to say it in a way that I could understand it. And he'd get mad at me for being so slow. He'd be impatient with me and say I should do my own work. Well, that is the reason that no one else appreciates him. And I just viewed it as a foible then. Now I view it as a flaw because I'm trying to do the same thing myself in my own work, which is to explain it well enough so other people get it. I view that as part of the task of research. Wheeler's a genius at that, of course. Wheeler can write these books that are popular and engage the entire public on down to people who just read the sports pages. Wheeler has come up with ideas like black holes, which is now part of the vernacular. That may be why Wheeler is also impatient with Putnam's singular inattention to bridging from his own way of first understanding something to the way the academics understand it, and finally on all the way to the way that the public understands it. But I tried, in fact, to interest two well-known scholars now in Putnam's having been the first, to see the brain as a Darwin machine. They are Edelman, who got a Nobel Prize, not for his work on brain function, but for some other work, and William Calvin, who has several books on the brain as a Darwin machine. I think one of them has that title, more or less. And I wrote them letters and talked to Calvin in person. No response, no interest, no nothing. I even cited, the famous example of Mendel, who discovered the laws of genetics 20 years before they were rediscovered independently in Germany and other European countries by famous people. Well, one of these three independent rediscoverers of the Mendelian laws of genetics did a literature search and discovered this monk nobody had ever heard of named Gregor Mendel, who'd come up with the exact same laws 20 years earlier. And so out of his integrity, he cited Mendel for this. Did Calvin or Edelman cite Putnam? No.
They don't want to hear about it.
They don't want to hear about it.
It's a different era of what integrity means.
Absolutely. It's a different era of what integrity means. And I honor the fellows who cited Mendel almost as much as I do Mendel himself, for having the integrity and the scientific honesty to cite him for that. Their names are not known to anybody except for the fact that they rediscovered Mendel. Somebody's going to rediscover Putnam someday and realize that he was the first ever to see that the brain works by the same principles of natural selection as the animal kingdom has evolved.